I'm Speech Thomas from the hip-hop crew Arrested Development. On the new VPM podcast, Track Change, I take you behind the walls of Richmond City Jail, where I help 4 men record an album and hear how they're trying to break free from a cycle of addiction and incarceration.
Been so long since I've been free.
Subscribe to Track Change in your podcast app.
Welcome to RVA's Got Issues, a podcast about politics and public affairs in and around Richmond, Virginia. I'm your host, Rich Marr. On this episode, RVA's Got Issues with climate vulnerability. Climate change is here today in RVA.
Man, shoot, for this past couple of days, it's been hot. It's been too hot.
We'll talk with a local scientist about how changes in the environment affect our local communities and what we can do about it.
The future right now is entirely and dominantly predicated on how much carbon humans emit over the next few decades.
Then RVA's got questions about the city of Richmond's lack of a Department of Transportation. Why don't we have one of those, and why would we need one? Finally, for our community spotlight, we'll talk with entrepreneur Richard Winch about the state of tech in RVA. All that coming up on RVA's Got Issues. On this episode, RVA's Got Issues with climate vulnerability. We're joined by Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, Director of Climate Justice and Impact at the nonprofit environmental group Groundwork USA. He's an expert on the impact of extreme heat on our cities and, more importantly, on our health. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a joy to be here.
Now, Jeremy, everyone is worried about climate change, or they should be. Some folks are using this term climate vulnerability to talk about how vulnerable residents are to the effects of climate change. What does climate vulnerability look like here in RVA?
I think it's helpful to think about what we mean when we say vulnerability. And really, it's a combination of 2 different things happening at the same time. Your exposure to a given climate threat, something like an extreme heat wave or flooding brought on by extreme precipitation. So that's the exposure. How acutely do you feel that climate risk? And then there's the adaptive capacity that you have. That's generally thought of as being really intertwined with things like socioeconomics. Does someone have disposable income that they can spend on an additional air conditioning unit for their window in their bedroom or in like the top floor of their home? Can they even have air conditioning, on their building? So those 2 things together, when you kind of add up, like how bad is it where you live? How many resources do you have to expend on keeping yourself safe or removing yourself from that exposure? Those 2 things together overlap into what we generally like to think of as being a vulnerability.
Yeah, and this is geographic, right? Like we can map that almost literally. And in fact, that's what you did with some of your research, right? When you first started examining what we call heat islands, right? You've been looking at climate vulnerabilities across the U.S., but you started with this research in Richmond, right? So it's basically, if there's a heat wave, people suffer, of course, but you notice that people suffer differently in different parts of the city.
Right. So the interesting thing here is that this idea of an urban heat island has actually been around for like 200 years. It started with a British scientist that had a thermometer in downtown London and a thermometer outside in the rural countryside. Between those 2 locations, it was consistent that the city was always a little bit warmer. What we added to the conversation was an acknowledgement that behind that trend is land use. Hard, impervious surfaces tend to absorb more of the sun's energy throughout the day and then re-emit it back into the air as heat in the afternoon and into the evening.
The problem is we're building so fast because there's not room here and people want to live here. And when you do that, you put in man-made concrete, asphalt buildings. What you're doing is creating a man-made oven.
We teamed up with a team of researchers, my colleague Vivek Chandas at Portland State, on doing this methodology that he had developed at Portland State. And we applied it to here in Richmond using volunteer scientists to do the mapping. We put a bunch of thermometers on cars. Several of us rode bikes and rode around and drove around during a heat wave in July of 2017. And we found some really dramatic things. First, that there was as much as, potentially more than a 16 degree Fahrenheit difference between two places at the exact same moment in a heat wave.
Within the city of Richmond.
Within the city of Richmond.
Yeah. And on a heat wave day, we're not talking about the difference between a nice 70 and a nice 55. I mean, this is like 85 to 100. This is 90 to 105. Like these are really degrees that you can feel the difference.
I think it was 87 to 103.
Yeah.
So 87 is below what we would consider a threshold for a heat advisory day. Even within the city, you have two places that, from a emergency management standpoint, one place would have a heat advisory, the other place wouldn't. We've now shown that these hotter areas have higher rates of heat-related ambulance responses during the summer. There's also issues related to energy use. If you live in a hotter neighborhood, you tend to have a higher energy intensity need. And that can be complicated for people on fixed incomes and very low income, as well as then their infrastructural damages. Extreme heat can cause steel structures and roadways to become warped and bent and damaged. So concentration of heat in one place damages a lot of things, from public health to the built environment itself.
And so how does this shake out, like specifically in Richmond? Like what are some of the neighborhoods that you were seeing this kind of distinction in?
A lot of the coolest areas and neighborhoods were very much concentrated on the west side of the city. Many of our parks, I think the coolest temperature was actually registered near Pump House Park. On the flip side, many of the warmest places were like Shockoe Bottom, Manchester at the time, Scott's Addition, and many of the neighborhoods like Gilpin, right off of the interstate. So again, what do you think about where those places are? Would you think of paved over bricks, dark colors, not a lot of trees? So basically any neighborhood you can think of being along that spectrum of extremely shaded to extremely unshaded. And that pretty much defined the temperature gradients.
Right. And so there's a historical aspect to these disparities between the hot neighborhoods and the not so hot neighborhoods, right?
It's so clear that the systems that sought to segregate our neighborhoods along class and race lines echo in the present day as disparate exposure to extreme heat and other climate risks. And we have a hypothesis about this is through that, the tax base is diminished, and therefore we have flows of capital, environmental capital, into places where they are politically connected, wealthy, and, able to advocate for these things.
Do you think this heat impacts people differently?
Yes, I sure do. I mean, it impacts your mental, your health. So, I mean, if you have like serious health issues, I don't advise for you to be out here in this heat. Yeah, stay in that AC. If you want to go to the pool, come to the pool and get some cool air up in here. Have some fun.
And so your scientific research really has opened up eyes, right? Your research team has expanded to look at other cities. This is kind of now a national model, right? It's been picked up by the federal government for thinking about funding, right?
Yeah, we were really lucky in 2018. We went to Washington, D.C., and city of Baltimore. The following year, it was in Boston, and they did the most Boston thing ever and called it Wicked Hot Boston. I mean, it couldn't have gotten better. And then, it's just snowballed out from there, quite literally. Now it's been over 70 communities nationwide have used our model to approach their extreme heat exposure. And why it is certain neighborhoods have fewer trees, connecting the history of a place to the present, as well as understanding more clearly who it is that is disproportionately impacted by the heat.
We're talking with Dr. Jeremy Hoffman about heat islands and the effects of climate change in RVA. We'll hear more about what we can do to combat it, including Richmond's comprehensive plan, when we come back on RVA's Got Issues.
There is so much happening in the news every single day. Keep up with it all by subscribing to the VPM Daily Newscast. It's a roundup of Central Virginia's top stories in less than 10 minutes from the VPM News team. The VPM Daily Newscast is available on NPR One or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is RVA's Got Issues. We're back with Dr. Jeremy Hoffman of Greenworks USA talking about the effects of climate change in RVA. So we've mentioned that you and some other groups are doing some work to try to combat this. Let's get back to the city's big plan about this, RVA Green 2050. First, talking a little bit about the problems it identifies. It talks about these heat islands. There's a quote from you in there that says that what we can expect in looking forward to the future is hotter, wetter, sneezier, and wheezier. Can you unpack that a little bit? We got the hotter part for sure, right?
Yeah. I love how it's such a descriptive 4 words.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think anybody necessarily wants that.
Yeah, it sounds like a really bad Dr. Seuss book that you don't want to be in, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Man, brilliant. Rich, I didn't even think about how that's possible. So hotter, wetter, sneezier, and wheezier comes out of my summary of decades of federal climate reports, basically saying that the southeastern region of the United States will have longer and stronger heat waves, wetter in the sense of more extreme precipitation events, dumping more rain in a shorter amount of time over the same place. Sneezier in the sense that our pollen seasons have gotten more intense, which drives then allergic rhinitis reactions and other forms of respiratory issue. And then wheezier in the sense that we have wildfires from thousands of miles away that under the right meteorological conditions, that smoke can subside into our region and make the worst air quality events that we've experienced in decades happen in a very short amount of time.
So then how is RVA Green 2050 as a plan trying to address these conditions, the hotter, wetter, sneezier, or wheezier?
I think the RVA Green 2050 Climate Equity Action Plan really does a good job of summarizing how different actions and the ideas of our community can serve each one of those impacts, whether it be through transportation related changes that lowers the burden of air pollution on our communities, to investing in things like urban and community forestry, which limits the amount of extreme heat exposure that these communities experience, as well as advocating for things like green infrastructure to soak up and filter stormwater before it gets into the river. And then thankfully, we live at the fall line of the James. Sea level rise isn't a particularly big issue for us necessarily here, but just down the street, we could have a lot of people moving towards us as a way to get away from those sorts of stressors. So I think the Climate Equity Action Plan does a lot to identify ways that we can be working together to reduce that hotter, wetter, sneezier, wheezier future.
And so what would success look like for this plan?
I think success at the very base level would be meeting or exceeding our carbon emissions goals. From the plan's perspective, 100% like net zero emissions of CO2. I know the city has been doing a lot on trying to understand how their carbon emissions are produced, and then as well as providing resources for the community writ large on how to reduce their emissions. So I want to make sure that I say the future right now is entirely and dominantly predicated on how much carbon humans emit over the next few decades. And that relies on cutting carbon emissions immediately and substantially.
So let's ask about that. You were very clear in saying that climate change is something we can still do something about. So what can our listeners do to help?
Oh, man. I love this question because I think in some ways it's like looking at the menu and seeing the buffet of climate action that's in front of you and sampling, as many of the things as you want. And so for me, I like to talk about your backyard, your neighborhood, and then the city. Okay, so you've got your house, your apartment, your whatever situation you're in, where you can be having decisions around what you eat, how it's produced, where it's from, and other kind of like personal choice things. Now, there are also ways that you can change the energy, just determining if your energy provider, which by and large is going to be Dominion, they have a 100% renewable energy option that you can go and actually select. So in your neighborhood, your HOA, your community organizations, you can get involved with them to further their mission. Working with one of these local community organizations, start a new urban garden and, train people to be stewards of it, plant some trees and so on. So it's really taking what you're doing at your home and then trying to inspire others at that next level up. And here in the city, we have a very high awareness of environmental issues. We have a lot going for us as far as options for climate action at that neighborhood level. And then regionally, so on, engaging more with levels of governance that are above city level, our representatives in the General Assembly. There's been, over the last several General Assembly sessions, there's been a huge amount of environmental bills, and some are successful, some are not, but kind of joining up and thinking about what a state level organization that reflects your values and, aiding their mission or going to testify on behalf of a given bill that might affect your life is a great way to push for that kind of investment elsewhere.
Dr. Jeremy Hoffman is Director of Climate Justice and Impact at Groundwork USA. Jeremy, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy.
On each episode of RVA's Got Issues, we'll answer a question from listeners like you, something you want or need to know about your government or community. On this episode, RVA's got questions about the Department of Transportation. Amber Coles, our producer, is back. Hi, Amber.
Hi, Rich.
So you got a question?
We do. We have a question that was emailed to us from Chris L. of Richmond. Chris writes, why doesn't Richmond have a Department of Transportation? What are the impacts of this decision, and how can we increase pedestrian safety? Sounds a little similar to a question we had a while ago about pedestrian safety.
Yeah, people are very concerned about it. But let's first define what we're talking about with this Department of Transportation, a DOT, right? It's the department that covers everything that relates to streets, highways, bridges, sidewalks, buses, trains. Amber, did you know that the city of Richmond didn't have a Department of Transportation?
I didn't know that they were supposed to at all. I thought VDOT just kind of handled everything.
Right. VDOT is the state agency, the Virginia Department of Transportation at the state level. So we do have a state agency, but there's no Department of Transportation, no DOT at the city level.
So does that mean because Richmond doesn't have a DOT, our streets won't be paved, we can't move, we're
Yes.
kind of just stuck?
Yeah, we're just going to have to stay home all the day. It's like going back to the pandemic. No, that's not true. In fact, most of these functions are handled by the city, but they're handled by the Department of Public Works, so the DPW, as well as we have other agencies like the GRTC, which handles the bus network, because that goes beyond the city borders.
So is Richmond kind of just being weird because it seems like other people have a DOT, but we just don't for some reason?
Yeah, it's not that weird. I mean, lots of local governments don't have a DOT, a Department of Transportation. Chesterfield County does. The city of Norfolk does, but it's really not all that common. I'm not actually aware of any studies or data that shows that having a DOT in your city produces better outcomes. And I think really what people want, and maybe what this listener wants, is just to make sure that the city pays a lot of attention to things like pedestrian safety and the quality of our roads.
So if we have GRTC and DPW, do we actually need a DOT?
Yeah, I mean, adding a department like that would be a big change. Lots of disruption, more staff, new costs. I mean, maybe a new mayor wants to try to do that.
That feels like a heavy lift.
Yes.
Just don't do that.
Don't do that. Yeah. But the city's doing things, right? The city has produced a comprehensive plan. It's called Richmond Connects that lays out our transportation plans for the future.
So if I have a problem with a road, a bridge, a pothole, a sinkhole, what am I supposed to do in the city if we don't?
Right. So you can still use the RVA 311 app or call 311 if you're in the city, or go to the website. You can also go to the state agency, to VDOT. They have a form you can fill out at my.vdot.virginia.gov. But you can try one of those things to see if somebody can help you with your street problem.
So again, a lot of avenues to kind of get your questions answered.
That's right. So Amber, what do listeners do if they have a different question about their local government or community?
If you have a question, you can do just like Chris did and email us at rvasgotissues@vpm.org. Or you can go to our really fancy website and click on the wonderful Ask a Question button.
It is wonderful. Thank you, Amber.
Thanks, Rich.
RVA is, in many ways, a place for technology and innovation. From Dominion Energy Innovation Center in Ashland to VCU Da Vinci Center downtown to Chesterfield's Meadowville Technology Park, there are lots of smart, creative people around Richmond. But are we doing tech right? To help answer that question, we're shining our community spotlight on Richard Winch. He's the executive director of Startup Virginia, a business incubator and hub in Shockoe Bottom in downtown Richmond. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you.
So let's say I wake up tomorrow morning and I have this $1 million idea, right?
Yeah.
And I tinker around my garage for a while and get a couple of bucks from my uncle. And now I have this product and I think it's a really good idea. And I come to you folks at Startup Virginia. What are the kinds of things you would help me do to help grow my company?
Sure. So what we would do in this case is that we have a program called the Idea Factory, and the state has a program called ICAP. And we would say you need to go through one of these programs before you join our incubator. And those programs are purely focused on the business model canvas and customer discovery.
Right. So like learning the basics of how to run a business.
More
right?
importantly, learning who is your customer and are they willing to pay for your product that you're trying to create for them. So that's the number one thing you need to answer.
Right. So once I've sorted out those basics and then I am able to join your incubator, then what happens? What are you folks working with me on?
And when you would go into our idea stage, because you still have an idea, and then we would continue to help you through the process of validating your idea and hopefully building a minimal viable experiment or just something to start testing the clients. And if once you start gathering some clients and start having some paying customers, you would launch into our launch side of the incubator. But we're now starting to work with you on how do you successfully launch your company, whether it comes from employment, legal, business modeling, sales especially is vitally important at that stage. And then you go to our growth stage once you've gone through that. And that's typically when you have, a lot of quite a bit of revenue, you have raised capital, and you're now ready to expand geographically.
So you said you're a nonprofit. So that's a kind of question, right? Because there are groups that help businesses grow, but they're looking to make money off of it. So what's in it for you, Richard? What's in it for your organization?
It's really what's in it for our donors. They contribute to our cause because they see the importance of innovation and technology to move our region forward and providing the right tools necessary to do so. One of our founders, Brad, says, how can we help founders grow faster and smarter than they would on their own? If the answer is we've helped just a little bit, whether it's space, whether it's mentoring, whether it's coaching, whether it's connections to fundraising, then we've accomplished our mission.
And so tech doesn't exactly have a good reputation nationally all the time. Why should people care about the work you're doing? Why should people care about technology companies? What are the benefits of having a good tech sector here in RVA?
I would say every community wants to strive to leverage technology to be better. Every single business, whether you're just starting up a restaurant to a very established company such as CarMax, needs to leverage technology. And now with artificial intelligence becoming even more and more prevalent, I think educating and being at the forefront of technology is vital for every community across the world, not just the United States.
Right. So do you have examples of this? You kind of mentioned like a restaurant, or is there an example of a company that a layperson would normally think of as needing technology that you have helped develop some technology to use?
I would say one that's recent is Joe Belstering with Major Clarity. He found a need in the edtech sector of how do you coach and teach entrepreneurs? How do you coach and teach potential pathways to careers to students? So he created a tech tool that allows students to explore different types of careers and where should they adjust their major or education based on the careers that they want to do. He scaled that really nicely and importantly addressed a really important community need across the nation. And not only that, he's an amazing founder that gives back to our community.
This is someone from Richmond who's doing this, right?
Well, he's done it. And he sold his company and now he gives back and is part of our community still.
Yeah, that's great. And so thinking about not just the people who are here, right, but he could be here, he could have been somewhere else, right? There's a competition aspect to technology as well, right? If we don't have technology companies here or people investing in tech here, then that might go somewhere else, right? To another state, another city. How are we doing in terms of competing with other localities, other states here in Richmond?
I think we're doing good. I think I like to see opportunities rather than challenges. The opportunity we have in Richmond is that a lot of people love the quality of life that we have here. from our geographic location, from our climate. Our size city is now very popular. And technologists since the pandemic can kind of choose where they want to go and where they want to work. So I would say that's an opportunity for us as a region and an opportunity that we are taking advantage of.
So they can be anywhere they want to be.
They really can. And I would say that's our opportunity. We would love to find more technologists that want to start companies in our region. Compared to other regions, I would say we're pretty low on that.
So when we talk about who we're competing with,
Yep.
Is it local cities? Is it cities across the country? Who are we comparing ourselves to in terms of the kind of tech sector that we have and that we want?
I would say regions with about 1 million people. It's easy to look at San Francisco, New York, even LA, Nashville, Austin. I would even put Raleigh in this and say we need to be like that. The reality is we won't. And we need to come up with our version of a tech city. They have done some really good economic development initiatives to attract some big tech companies. And without those tech companies coming to your region, that's not going to change much. So I would say we need to be looking at the cities of our size, seeing what they're doing to attract talent and replicating those efforts so we can stay ahead of them. Kathy Graziano used to be on city council, once told me, Richmond grows despite itself. Just imagine if you enabled it. And I think we still have a great opportunity as a region to work and leverage our amazing private community and I would say really solid public sector to really combine forces and really make a difference in our region.
So you're making the case for tech here pretty well, but there are some folks who are still very skeptical of tech, just concerns about billionaires coming in and too much money and housing costs skyrocketing, right? Some of the complaints people make about San Francisco, for example. What's your response to that? How do you push back against folks who have that kind of skepticism?
I would say it's correct. I would say that we've witnessed it, especially since the pandemic, of what that is doing to our region. And it is impacting our quality of life. It's not as cheap, affordable as it used to be. I think housing is probably going to be our largest issue. And if you look at all those successful tech cities that I mentioned, Nashville, Raleigh, Austin, who were similar sized cities to us maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, they are having severe congestion issues, affordable housing issues, and we need to stay up front of that. And I do know that a lot of folks are spending a lot of time on the affordable housing and the workforce development piece so that we can keep on top of it. We would be kidding ourselves if it hasn't already impacted us and it isn't going to impact us more because we're on the map and people are looking to move here. And with that are drawbacks. The only way we fix those drawbacks is by having a strong public and private sector together working on it.
Richard Winch is Executive Director of Startup Virginia. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
That's our show. Thanks to our guests, Jeremy Hoffman and Richard Winch. RVA's got issues, but we need you to tell us what those issues are. Submit a question or tell us about something exciting going on in your community at our website, rvasgotissues.vpm.org. For example, most of the monuments are gone, so what do we do with Monument Avenue? If you've got an idea or know someone who does, drop us a line. Join us next time when RVA's got issues with, well, if you want to know, subscribe to us wherever you download podcasts. While you're at it, tell a friend about us, share a social media post, or even leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Let's get everyone in RVA listening. RVA's Got Issues is produced by Max Wasserman and Amber Coles and edited by Steve Lack. Our theme music was composed by Alexander Hitchens. Meg Lindholm is our executive producer. Steve Humble is VPM's Chief Content Officer. I'm your host, Rich Marr. Thanks for listening.
Do you have an idea for the next great podcast? Want $10,000 to help bring it to life? Enter your idea in this year's Resonate Podcast Festival pitch party and turn your vision into a reality. 3 finalists will be invited to Richmond, Virginia in October to convince an expert panel of judges why their pitch is the next must-listen podcast. I'm Emily Reeves, and last year, I was one of those finalists. Now, my idea has become a 4-part documentary series called Violence Week. Stick around to hear a short trailer and find Violence Week wherever you listen to podcasts. You can submit your podcast idea at resonatepodfest.com. Entries close August 31st. They called it Violence Week.
And I turned my back on the one student who I found out the next day had a gun.
This is not a little bit of pushing around. Someone is going to get killed here. Someone is going to die at this school.
I'm Emily Reeves, and I'm back at my old high school in East Lansing, Michigan, because I can't stop thinking about what happened here earlier this year. There was a rise in violence and an ensuing community crisis that left behind big questions about school safety, policing, and at its heart, racial equity.
And take politics and race out of it, because if there's an active shooter, I don't care what they are.
And like so many American stories, it revolves around a gun.
It just made me be like, they can do whatever they want. They can do whatever they want.
It's changed that serve and protect, because I'm just like serve and protect too.
This is high school. Why do we have to be worried about if this is the day that they're finally gonna bring guns in here and we're gonna die?
Join me for Violence Week, a journey through high school halls and police precincts.
VPM,